Good evening, everyone. My name's Kevin Lee, and I'm the chairman of the Brooklands members. And it's my privilege tonight to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is an expert on all things Cold War. He flew Tornado in action during the 80s. And I introduce you to Michael Napier.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you this evening. Air power in the Cold War is a massive subject. So, so what I propose to do is to talk first about strategic air forces, the Soviet, the US, and NATO air forces, because that strategic picture then puts everything else into context. I'm then going to talk about the tactical air forces. Now, that's going to be quite brief. It's a massive subject, and I'm conscious of the fact we've all got homes that we want to go to tonight. So what I propose to do is talk just about one particular aspect, and the aspect that I thought would be of most interest to all of us this evening was the British contribution to air power in continental Europe. And I was also instructed to make sure that this talk was relevant in some way to Brooklands. So we're then going to talk about, finish talking about air-to-air refuelling for reasons that will become apparent once we get there. Before that, though, I do want to establish my own very tenuous link with Brooklands, not just because we're in the Napier room, but also this is me learning to fly in 1977, and if you look on the far right-hand side there, you can see the word Brooklands. So I learned at the Brooklands School of Flying. It was actually based at Northampton, Sywell in Northampton at the time, but I can say... apparently it's formed here, but they moved there in 1930 sometimes. But I can say I learnt to fly at Brooklands. But we digress, because we're here to talk about the Cold War. And for the purpose of this evening, we're going to say that started in 1949 with the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which itself was formed really on the back of the Berlin airlift, which had started the year before. And we'll say that it very conveniently finished exactly 40 years later with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And let's just remind ourselves of the sort of geopolitical situation there. And here you can see Europe as it was in the Cold War, with the goodies on the left and the baddies on the right. And the line of contact there through the inner German border between East and West Germany. But if we just zoom out slightly, we can see a slightly different picture. We've got that big red blodge there, and then a big sort of gap in the middle of the blue bit. The clue, of course, being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But one might, from that map, look and think, America, main protagonists, and the USSR are actually a long way apart, and also the main line of conflict runs east to west. But if we tilt that view around slightly, we can see that, in fact, the two main protagonists actually face each other across the Arctic Circle, and the lines of conflict actually run north-south pretty much through the North Pole. So let's, with further ado, look at the Soviet air forces and note the use of the plural there, because we've actually got two completely independent air forces there. Firstly, the VVS. I'm sorry, I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to pronounce the Russian words here, so I use the abbreviations. The VVS, the Soviet Air Force, and that was divided into two parts. The DA, literally long-range aviation, which we might call strategic aviation, Strategic Air Command, and the FA, which we would call probably Tactical Air Command. And then a completely separate organisation, the PVO, and that was responsible for the air defence of the USSR, and it had its own flying training system, its own command structure, its own aircraft, so completely and utterly independent from the VVS. Oh, we're on to a different one. Fantastic. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah. Oh, just hang on. No, that doesn't either.
Hang on. Try it now.
No.
Not much luck there, are we?
No, we're not. Oh, I'll just press the buttons, it's easy.
Okay. Carry on.
Thank you. So we'll talk about the PVO later on, but let's look at the DA to start with. And the first thing to... We're fated. There we go. Yeah, so the first thing to have in mind is that whereas the British and the Americans had all run strategic air campaigns against Russia and Japan, the Soviets didn't have any strategic air campaign at all. So they really started the Cold War right from a standing start. And the first aeroplane they started with was this, and I bet some of you are thinking that's a B-29. But it isn't. Yeah, you're right. It's a Tupolev-4, codename Bull. A quick word about NATO codenames. A bit like me with the previous slide, not wanting to use the Russian words, not knowing perhaps the Russian words. Oh, we could be in a bit. We'll try it again in a moment. And also some consideration about the actual designations of Russian aircraft. NATO introduced a codename system. Bomber aircraft, codename begins with a B. Fighter aircraft, an F. One syllable, it's a propeller aircraft. Two syllables, it's a jet aircraft. And this Bull it looks remarkably like a B-29 because it is in fact a reverse-engineered B-29. A number of the aircraft that were bombing Japan were damaged and crash-landed either in China or in Russia. And when the Russians had to build their own strategic air force, they thought, wow, we'll use these and reverse-engineer them. And the problem with the B-29 was that it was actually, by that stage, by the Cold War stage, obsolete, and also it did not have an intercontinental range. Also, the Russians were missing this. The first Soviet drop was in 1949. If we consider that the Americans dropped their first one in 1945, so we've got a sort of 4-year advantage, and by about 1950, the Americans had a total of about 50 weapons and about 120 aircraft that could drop them. You can see that there were not that many nuclear weapons around in those first years of the Cold War. But the Russians started building nuclear weapons. They also started building rather more impressive aeroplanes. And that is one of them. That's a Tupolev-16, a Badger. A very robust design, and that saw service right the way through from when it first came into service, about 1954, all the way through to the end of the Cold War. And this aeroplane, too, the Tupolev-95 Bear, again, another really wonderful design, which those aircraft are still in service to this day. There was a third aircraft, actually, as a strategic bomber, and this is a Bison, and a good reason for code words. It's a Myasishchev either M3 or 4M, depending. And this was envisaged as a strategic bomber, but in the end it wasn't actually particularly successful. And by the end of the 1950s, it had been relegated to being an air-to-air refueling tanker for the Bear aircraft. Now that brings me on to the fact that the Badger, when we looked at it, it's not a massive aeroplane, and that didn't really have an intercontinental range. So how to give it one? That the Soviets tried was air-to-air refueling. And they had a rather interesting technique. I'm not quite sure which nutcase designed this. But you can imagine, massively difficult, first of all, to make contact and then to stay in contact. So that was not the most successful method of doing it. A rather more successful method was, and busy slide coming up, what I'm showing you here are the little red dots, which are all the airfields that were built in the Arctic Circle. These were known as bump airfields, and the idea was that the aircraft would get airborne from their bases in central USSR, fly out to a bump airfield, land there, refuel, and then set off, having had a bit of a head start on their way. The Russians also tried using the Arctic pack ice as a forward base. And there were what are called drift stations, which were research stations, which were set up on the ice. And they would then be there and then drift with the pack ice as it drifted through the season. And in 1958, a Badger landed next to one of these drift stations, and the idea was to see if that could be used. It landed successfully, but then when it tried to maneuver to take off again, it then crashed somewhere along on the ground and never managed to take off. So that idea was binned. But again, a more practical idea was to use standoff missiles. And here you can see a Bear aircraft. It's got a missile on it called a Kangaroo missile with a range of about 300 miles. So that's the sort of standoff that you could take, add 300 miles to range, but also stand off a little bit from the defences. Now, as you can see, it's all quite complicated trying to get a heavy bomber all the way from the USSR across to the USA to attack a target. And the Russians decided pretty early on that this wasn't the best way of doing it, and they were rather more interested in rockets. So the Soviet ballistic missile systems really took over from aircraft, or were a much more important part of the Soviet nuclear force. And just to put that in perspective, throughout the Cold War, to start with, probably only about 200 Soviet strategic bombers, and from the mid-1960s onwards, probably only about 150. If you compare that with the American figure is about 600 bombers all the way through. But this didn't stop the Soviets coming up with more modern designs. This is a Tupolev 22M3 backfire, came in the early 1970s, originally designed to be a strategic bomber, but its air-to-air refueling capability was deleted as part of the strategic arms limitation talks. These aircraft, again, still in service, but very much more a tactical asset rather than a strategic one. And also this aircraft, which came in the 80s, this is a Tupolev 160 Blackjack. Now, this looks very similar to an American B-1 bomber, but actually it's quite a different machine. It's actually massively bigger. Just to put in perspective, the wingspan of this is about the same as a B-52, so we're talking a huge, great aeroplane. But there were massive problems with actually introducing them into service, and only 17 of these were built, although they're still around to this day. That's the bombing side of the DA of the VVS. And I talked about the PVO, the defensive organisation. And this slide sort of demonstrates the problem that they had to face. A massive coastline there that needed to be defended. And the problem of airplanes like this, MiG-17 Fresco fighter, high-performance airplane, but very, very short range. So if you're going to have those based all the way along that coast, you need a massive number of airplanes. And what the Soviets decided to do instead was to concentrate on sort of defensive bastions, if you like, around strategic. So places like industrial complexes, military installations, large cities and things like that. And the idea was that you'd have an airfield there or airfields with fighter aircraft. This, the MiG-19 Farmer, which took over from MiG-17. And these were integrated into a defensive system. So the aircraft will be very closely controlled by a radar controller. This is one of their ground control intercept GCI radars. And the aircraft were very closely controlled right from takeoff all the way around, vectored around and to make an intercept. And really all the pilot did was to take off the airplane and then land it and then press the fire button when so told, because the GCI controller would basically have a data link which straight into the aircraft autopilot can actually fly the airplane around. The reason for this close control, or one of the reasons was, apart from their distrust of everybody, was that the Russians, as I've mentioned, were very keen on rockets, and they then integrated the surface-to-air missile system into the air defences. This is a SAM-2, and the great thing about these is that they had a massive performance, could reach right up to 70-odd thousand feet, which the fighters couldn't get that high. And the reason why that was important was because at the time, American aircraft, this U-2, could fly with impunity right across the USSR. And indeed, all the US and NATO aircraft were all, the tactic was to come in at high level above most of the defences and make it difficult for the defences to reach them. In the May of 1960, Gary Powers, his U-2, was shot down, and that really was a sort of, that marked the end, really, of being able to fly in at high level for NATO and the US forces, because that was now shut off by the use of SAM-2 missiles, which were going to take aircraft out. So NATO and the USA had to switch down to low-level tactics, and we'll come into those, onto those a bit later on. In the meantime, though, the Soviets introduced a longer-range aircraft, which they could then push out the barriers. Aircraft like this is a Yakolov 28, a Firebar, and this airplane, the Tupolev 128 Fiddler, again, a huge, great airplane, designed specifically for long-range interceptions over the Arctic Ocean. And finally, Sukhoi 15, this is a Flagon. This is the most numerous aircraft used by the PVO from the 60s onwards. And in fact, it was these airplanes that shot down the Korean Airlines 747 back in 1983. You probably remember that. With these longer-range aircraft, the possibility came to them base them further. This slide probably looks very similar to the one that I showed you a little while back with the bombers. But these are forward fighter bases designed to be able to let aircraft fly out over and make interceptions over the Arctic Ocean. Just that one, I'll see if we can use this without breaking anything. Here we are. Rogachevo there. I just mentioned that. That's on a big island there called Novaya Zemlya, and that is out in the middle of nowhere, quite literally. So far out in the middle of nowhere, in fact, that's where the Soviets did all their nuclear tests. So you can imagine if you're a fighter pilot living there, there's nothing there apart from the rocks, the ice, and probably a bit of background radiation as well. So really quite a miserable life, I'd imagine. Newer aircraft came in the 1970s. The MiG-25 Foxbat, very high-performance airplane, a Mach 3 airplane, originally designed really against the high-level bombers which had preceded it by 10 years, really, but nevertheless an important interceptor. And this, the MiG-23 Flogger. But the thing about these aircraft was that although they were much more capable than earlier designs, they still lacked a look-down, shoot-down radar. So they were completely reliant on the ground-controlled intercept, really, to find low-level targets. And if you think that the reason for coming at low level was it kept you under the radar horizon, so the GCI controller would have a lot less notice to then send an interceptor out, and then the interceptor then has to find a target which is probably down at 100 feet or so. And one of the interesting things is that although the tactics were or the Soviets knew that Western tactics were flying at a very low level, they very rarely actually practiced intercepts at low level. And in fact, I don't think that anybody anywhere recorded as taking place below 2,000 feet. So you can imagine the difference between being at 2,000 feet and looking to try and find a bomber perhaps coming in at 100 or 200 feet is quite a challenge, really. And then to carry out an intercept on it at low level, which is a very demanding and unforgiving environment, would be quite a test, really. So quite how effective these guys have been, one doesn't really know. But these airplanes were superseded by yet better airplanes towards the end of talking about the late 80s now. A MiG-31 Foxhound development of the MiG-25, and this airplane, the so-called 27 flanker, a very, very capable airplane indeed. And with this airplane, I think the Soviets got much more aggressive in their flying. In fact, a couple of them collided with NATO aircraft on patrol. But a very, very capable airplane. And so, as you can see, towards the end of the Cold War, the Soviets did get their act together, and the PVO itself became a force which probably could be quite effective in its day. But let's head across the Arctic Ocean and look at the US Air Force. And this is divided up in a very similar way. You will not be surprised to know. You've got Strategic Air Command there, Tactical Air Command, and then the air defences of the US, initially Continental Air Command, CONAD, but from 1958 they amalgamated with the Canadians, with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and formed NORAD, the North American Air Defence System. And NORAD took a very different view to that which the PVO did in terms of defending the coastline. And what they did was to form a continuous line of radar defences. And you can see 3 lines there. In the yellow, that's the first one, the Pine Tree Line, which runs basically just north of the Canadian border, so covering the whole of the USA and covering places like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal on the east. And that was established in the late 1940s and then replaced in the mid-1950s by the Mid-Canada Line, and then ultimately at the top end there in the pink, you can see the distant early warning line, the DEW line, with radars that's stretching all the way across the Aleutians, across the north of Alaska, across the northern coast of Canada, and into Greenland. And all of these radars fed into a central system, a semi-automatic ground environment, or SAGE system, computerized, which then looked at all the threats and decided the best way to deal with all of them. And I'd also show that the blue lines there, the Atlantic and Pacific barrier lines, and those were maintained constant patrols of aircraft like this, EC-121 Warning Star. This has got 2 radars on it. On the belly, the big lump there, that's a search radar which looks in azimuth, and the one on the top, which scans up and down, which is it's got a fin thing, is a height-finding radar. So any targets could be tracked both in azimuth and in elevation as well. Feeding back to the fighters, and the fighters of the day to start with, this is a Lockheed F-94 Starfire, and its stablemate, the Northrop F-89 Scorpion. So, excuse me, let's grab a drink. And if you're thinking these things have got big fuel tanks on the wingtips, you're half right. The back half of those pods are fuel tanks, and the front half are rocket pods. and the aircraft were armed with unguided rockets. And the idea was they'd get behind a Soviet bomber and fire a salvo of unguided rockets, much like a shotgun effect, to take out the bomber. Now, the only problem with that is you can see these are straight-winged airplanes that don't go very fast, and we've already seen that the actual bombers of the day were actually swept-wing and did go very fast. So the chances of these actually working, I think, are fairly slim. An airplane that would be much more effective would be this, the North American F-86D Sabre Dog. And these were employed just as the Soviets used missiles, so the Americans and Canadians also did. This is a Bomark missile, Boeing, Oregon, I think it is, Aeronautical Research Center, I can't get it right, but BOMARC was the acronym, and also Nike missiles. These are used slightly differently from the Soviet system in that there was an outer layer of fighters, and then the missile engagement zones themselves were very much separated and not integrated in with the fighter zone, the missile zones. In fact, just to go back one, I mentioned about Gary Powers being shot down by a SAM-2 in their so-called integrated system, but I should point out that the SAM battery, which shot down Gary Powers, also shot down 2 of the MiG-19s that they were trying to intercept as well at the same time. So the Soviet system wasn't quite as integrated as perhaps they would have believed. But much better aircraft were soon on the books, and to the mid-1950s, aircraft like this, Convair 102 Delta Dagger, with Mach 2 performance, so a very high-performance airplane. It could be armed also with a Genie air-to-air missile, which itself could be nuclear-tipped. So the idea was you'd fly towards a huge, great formation of enemy bombers and fire a nuclear missile into the middle of it all and watch it all go bang. I think you perhaps would run away fairly quickly. So the F-102 Delta Dagger, and also this airplane, the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. This is in Canadian colours, and they were operated both by the Royal Canadian Air Force and also by the US Air Force, right the way through the late 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s. And they're also joined in the early 60s by the Convair F-106, a Delta Dart, very similar to Delta Dagger, which it kind of augmented and then later replaced. In fact, this airplane stayed in service right the way through up to the end of the Cold War itself. And you can see that here it's intercepting a Bear aircraft. Now, I mentioned there are only 120 or 150-ish strategic bombers in the Soviet Air Force, but this is not one of them. This version of the Bear, it's a Bear Delta, and it's actually a maritime reconnaissance aircraft. And you can see it's got a couple of lumps under it, and the one underneath is a search radar, so it's there to locate things like American carrier groups, and it would then send back the coordinates of the target to submarines or missile-armed ships to then fire missiles in, and then the front end of the airplane, that radome there, is a data link system, and that would then data link to the missiles and give them mid-course update to make sure they made it in the right way towards the target. The mid-1960s also saw this airplane, the McDonnell Douglas Phantom, I think probably one of the most iconic aircraft of the Cold War. And here you can still see they're still chasing off a Bear there. But the early 1970s, which is when the F-102 went out of service, and also the F-101 Voodoo, they were replaced by this airplane, the McDonnell Douglas F-15 Eagle, which is probably the ultimate fighter aircraft produced during the Cold War, I think. A very high-performance airplane, great range on it, massive, actually good weapon system, and a fantastic radar as well. So they don't get much better than this, which is probably why the Eagle's still in service. I did show you earlier on about those obscure places in the Arctic Circle where the Soviets put their fighters. The Americans, well, they were actually rather better off. This is Alaska, and I've just put this up just to show you a couple of places. So just here is Elmendorf, and here is Eielson. These are two big air bases up there, and they're actually by quite big cities. Elmendorf's just near Anchorage, and Eielson's up near... lost it off the top of my head at the moment, it'll come back in a minute, but Fairbanks. But you'll also see there's a couple of these here, King Salmon and Galena, which are two forward alert strips. So although they're alert strips and almost in the middle of nowhere, there were actually small settlements there. So as an American fighter pilot, you weren't that badly off. There were big cities in the main bases, and you might get sent off for a couple of weeks up somewhere where at least there were other people around as well. So not quite as miserable as Rogachevo. Let's switch across to look at the Strategic Air Command, and this actually is a B-29 this time, but as I mentioned, it didn't have an intercontinental range and it was really completely obsolete by the beginning of the Cold War, and these aircraft were swiftly replaced by the Convair B-36 Peacemaker. Massive, great machine. You can see it's got 6 pusher propellers there, and if I put this view up here, you can see it also had another 4 jet engines, so 10-engined aeroplane. How good's that? A huge, great thing, but a great sort of ponderous beast, really, and you can imagine it put up against things like MiG-17s and MiG-19s that we saw earlier on. It wasn't going to last very long, and so it was very quickly replaced. Initially by Boeing B-47, which came into service in about 1954. A great design, but if you look at it again, you can see it's not a massive machine and probably doesn't have a massively long range. So the first thing the Americans had to do was to work out how to get it across to the USSR, and like the Russians, they came up with air-to-air refueling as the way of doing it. Rather more successfully, it must be said. And in fact, this is refueling from a KC-97 Stratofreighter, and these aircraft, the Stratofreighters, later on the Stratotankers, became an integral part of the US strategic nuclear force. And so much so that they were used daily by the US bombers. These are the routes flown by B-47s every single day, nuclear armed, ready to go, so they get airborne. As you can see there, 6 of them heading across the Atlantic there, out towards Spain, refuel over Spain, head out towards Italy, turn around if they weren't called to launch and come back again. Similarly, more going up the northerly route, they're up into Greenland and around there a couple of times, and then the other route that takes you up through Alaska and right out into the Arctic Ocean. So these aircraft are, say, nuclear armed, ready to go, and those flights, 12 of them a day, would be split through the day, so at any stage there'd be about 4 or 5 aircraft which are ready to be launched and retasked to go out into the USSR and nuke them if required. This carried on actually right through the 60s, changed slightly. Here you can see one from the mid-60s, and the route's changed now, and it's basically just a lap of North America flown. This time by this airplane, the B-52. So the B-52 came into service 1955. Again, a massively successful design, and as we know, still in service to this very day. Another airplane, slightly less successful, but is this, the B-58 Hustler. And now this was designed, as I mentioned, to go in at high level. It was designed to go in at Mach 2, so really a sort of really high-performance airplane. It was going to go dashing in. Unfortunately, the change to low level was not kind to it, because in the thicker air downstairs, it didn't go as fast, and the jet engines burnt an awful lot more fuel, so it was rather a bit of a disaster, really, and it was a very difficult airplane to fly as well. But nevertheless, it soldiered on to 1970. In the meantime, the Americans, like the Russians, had decided that the way to make life easier was to actually have standoff missiles. And this airplane, if you look closely into the underwing, the pylons there, you can see hound dog missiles. And these, I mentioned the Kangaroo missile that had the Soviet one, which had a range of 300 miles. These things got a range of about 700 miles, so really good standoff range. And these are early cruise missiles, later replaced in the 70s by the short-range attack missile, the SRAM, and then later the air-launched cruise missile. And these could actually be carried internally in the bomb bay of the B-52. Finally, we've got this airplane, the B-1, which basically replaced the Hustler in many ways. It was intended originally to come into service in the early 1970s, but it was cancelled by the Carter administration, who didn't see the point in it. And then the Reagan administration, a few years later, reinstated it. So the B-1 came into service in the 1980s, again, as part of the American strategic nuclear arsenal, and remained in service. Remains to this day in service, but really more as a tactical airframe now. Instead. That's the American bomber side. We'll pop across the Atlantic now and look at NATO. And there were 2 air forces in NATO which had strategic nuclear weapons. Firstly, ourselves, the RAF, Bomber Command with the V-Force. And secondly, the French, CFAS there, which is their strategic air command. Look at the French first. So their first nuclear bomber looked like this. It's a Vautour. It doesn't look very convincing, and indeed it wasn't. The French nuclear weapon was first tested in 1960. And by the time it came into service, operational service, a couple of years later, this aeroplane had also come into service, the Mirage 4, which was designed specifically for the French independent nuclear weapon. Basically, it's a Mirage 3 that's been scaled up. Mirage 3, one pilot, one engine. This has got two pilots, two engines. It's about twice as big. Now, the French were actually thought quite a lot about how they were going to do this, and rather than keeping all their aircraft in one base, which would have been quite vulnerable to a counter-strike, their aircraft were scattered across the whole of France in groups of 4, and each of those 4 aircraft would also have with them their own tanker aircraft as an integral part of that unit. So French aircraft would get airborne Mirages with their tanker, would then be able to refuel, and then would be able to head off and reach into the USSR. And that system was maintained right through the 1960s, 70s, all the way to the end of the Cold War. In the meantime, we Brits, oh look, another B-29. This is called a B-29 Washington in RAF service, but as we've mentioned already, obsolete and replaced in the early 1950s by the V-Force. The 3 aircraft which you know and love, the Avro Vulcan, the Handley Page Victor, which I think actually takes the prize as one of the most beautiful looking airplanes ever designed. I mean, I think it's certainly one of the most futuristic. And even today, it looks like something out of a Dan Dare comic. But probably most important for all of us here, you'll recognise the Vickers Valiant. And the Valiant came into service in 1955, and not only did it come into service, but also almost straight away went into active service, dropping bombs during the Suez crisis. And it was also the only one of the V-bombers to actually drop real nuclear weapons. And here you can see 2 of the aircraft waiting at Christmas Island during the trials in 1957, where weapons were dropped. The weapon that became the British independent nuclear deterrent was this, a blue Danube weapon, and you can see it there. That's actually in front of a Valiant. So the Blue Danube Valiant and other V-bombers carried that nuclear deterrent from the late 50s right through to the early 60s. But as we have mentioned, or as I've mentioned, the 1960 was a kind of pivotal point where suddenly high-level bombing became impractical, and there's a switch to low-level. And unfortunately, low-level flying was not kind to the Valiant, and the stresses and strains of it caused all sorts of havoc with wing spars, and the airplane was very quickly withdrawn from service in 1965. But not before it had done some pioneering work in air-to-air refueling, and we'll cover that in a moment or two. But that left the Vulcan and the Victor with this weapon. You can see it hanging underneath the airplane, the Blue Steel missile. And the Blue Steel missile and the V-Force were the British independent nuclear deterrent through the 60s, right up until 1968, when it passed to the Royal Navy with the Polaris submarines and later on with the Trident missile system. Now, I said I'd talk about the tactical air forces, and I said also that I'd limit that just to the Royal Air Force in Germany, just so we all leave before it gets dark. And let's just remind ourselves of the geopolitical situation. Seen this map pretty much before. Goodies on the left, baddies on the right. And Germany is the big place where it all happens, East and West Germany and the inner German border. And on either side of that, so we've got the group of Soviet forces in Germany, East Germany, and on the western side, we've got Allied forces Central Europe, AFCENT, and that's divided into 2. The Northern Army Group, NORTHAG, which is British command and is basically British run, but also with Belgian, Dutch and German troops. And to the south, the Central Army Group, CENTAG, which is American commanded, American run, basically with Americans and Germans. And each of those army groups had its own tactical air force to support it. To the south, the 4th Allied Tactical Air Force, 4ATAF, which supported CENTAG, and in the north, 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force, 2ATAF, which supported NORTHAG. And that was basically mainly the RAF. And this is how it looked in the 1950s. You can see a massive force there, a huge number of airfields. Most of those airfields are actually ex-Luftwaffe bases from the wartime days, except for the 4 to the far west there, Laarbruch, Bruggen, Wildenrath and Geilenkirchen, which are actually purpose-built for the RAF in the early 1950s, were known as the clutch airfields. Initially, the RAF had wartime aircraft right up to 1949, Mosquitoes there, and also Spitfires, Tempests, but fairly early in the 1950s replaced mainly by airplanes like this, de Havilland Venom, and the Venom was actually the most numerous aircraft operated by the RAF in Germany in the mid-1950s, used both as an air defence fighter and also for ground attack missions, and then replaced in the mid to late 50s by the Hawker Hunter. And the Hunter was used again mainly as an air defence fighter, but also as a light ground attack aircraft, with the longer range ground attack taken by the Canberra. The Canberra fulfilled two roles, one as an interdictor, but also, most importantly, for nuclear strike, tactical nuclear strike. And indeed, from the mid-1950s right the way through to the late 1980s, RAF Germany had the various strike aircraft, which were all held at, or on each base there would be 4 aircraft held at readiness with nuclear bombs loaded, ready to go at 15 minutes' notice. That was all the way right up to the 1980s. And this airplane, you can see, if you look underneath it, you can see the bomb bay is cracked slightly open there. And the reason for that is it's got in there a American B-57 nuclear weapon, which was too big to close the doors. So when it was used in nuclear role, it had to fly around with the doors slightly ajar. So that, the Canberra and the Hunter largely, although the Lightning, as we'll see, did come into service in the mid-60s, but basically that saw us all from the late 50s through to 1969. That's the exact halfway point, really, of the Cold War. But that was when the RAF in Germany had a massive re-equipment program, which really put it up there with the best aircraft of the day. You can see, firstly, though, that by that stage it had shrunk somewhat from the 1950s. Just 4 bases there, Larbruck, Bruggen and Wildenroth, the clutch airfields to the west, and then Gütersloh out to the east. And the first aeroplane that came in to replace the Canberra was this, the Buccaneer. 2 squadrons of Buccaneers based up at Larbruck, carrying out both the conventional interdictor role and also nuclear strike. And then just down the road at Bruggen, 3 squadrons of Phantoms, which again were used in the ground attack and nuclear strike roles. I mentioned the Lightning. 2 squadrons of Lightnings were based at Gütersloh, and these aircraft were responsible not only for the air defence of the 2ATAF area, but also because of the 4 powers agreement, which at the end of the Second World War meant that only British, American, French or Soviet aircraft could police, during peacetime, could police the German airspace. So these guys at Gütersloh were responsible for the peacetime policing of German airspace as well. And the final aircraft type which came into service around about that time was this, the Harrier. So the Harrier designed specifically for close support of the Army. And 3 squadrons of these based at Wildenroth, but in wartime they would deploy out to field locations out in the east, and there they would support the Army as they were required there. That was how things ran for the first part of the 1970s, but in 1975 the Jaguar came into service, and the Jaguar replaced the Phantom at Bruggen. So we've now got the 2 squadrons of Buccaneers up at Larbruck still, but 4 squadrons now of Jaguars at Bruggen. And that left the Phantoms, which had previously been there, to switch to the air defence role to replace the Lightning. So we've got 2 squadrons now of Phantoms. These were based at Wildenrath, which meant that the 2 remaining Harrier squadrons at the time moved up to Gütersloh, which put them much closer to their deployment areas and also to their operating areas as well. That was how things ran basically for the next 10 years, from 75 up to 85. So pretty much the status quo. Then in 1985, along came this wonderful aeroplane, not that I'm biased at all, the Tornado GL1. And the thing about Tornado is with the terrain following system that it had, it actually could fly at night, it could fly in bad weather. So for the first time, the RAF in Germany had a 24-hour-a-day, 365-day-a-year ability to hit targets accurately over in East Germany or a bit further east to Poland. So 4 of these squadrons were based up at Larbruck, 4 at Bruggen, and I've just got a picture of Bruggen here actually. This is what it looked like. An east-west runway And then on each corner you can see hardened aircraft shelters, one set for each of squadrons there, for the 4 squadrons. On the far side, in the woods there, a weapon storage area, including a special weapon storage area, the nuclear stuff. And then on this side, engineering support, administrative support, and all the domestic site there with houses and messes, etc. So the population of that would be about 5,000 people, including all the families and everybody else there. The sharp end of it looked like this. And this is where my story joins in, because that's me just there. But as you can see, a really quite impressive number of aircraft. So 4 squadrons of these at Bruggen, 4 at Loughborough, I said. We've got 2 squadrons of Phantoms down the road at Wildernorth. We've got 2 squadrons of Harriers over at Gütersloh. 12 fast jet squadrons. Now, how many has the present RAF got? Not that many, about 6, I think. So it's about twice as big as the whole of the current RAF. The role of the Tornado in Germany was twofold. As I mentioned it, nuclear strike. This is the WE-177, the British independent tactical nuclear weapon. And aircraft that were not being used for nuclear missions would be used against enemy airfields. Now, very obviously, this is not an airfield in East Germany, unless this is sort of 1976 and there's been no rain for quite a long time. But it's actually, this is actually in Nevada. This is Talicha Peak Airfield in the Nellis Air Force Base ranges up in Nevada, north of Las Vegas. The reason I put it up there is because it's actually a one-to-one scale model, if you like, of an East German airfield. I think it's Jotterborg, but I'm not 100% certain that that's the one it is. But the reason I put this up is to demonstrate that the RAF in Germany practiced or very much against very realistic targets, flying very realistic missions. And if you think back to the Soviets with their no interceptions below 2,000 feet, you can see I think we're on a completely different footing in terms of professionalism and in terms of capability. Let's just finish off by talking about air-to-air refuelling. And as you can see, there's a Valiant there. You'll be excited to see. We'll talk about that in a bit. Just a quick reminder, the Russians tried it this way, which wasn't terribly successful. The Americans tried 2 different ways, actually. And the first is this. This is the probe and drogue method. So you have a hose drum unit on the tanker aircraft. That reels out or trails a hose. At the end of the hose, there's a drogue to stabilize it. On the receiver airplane, you have a probe. You fly the probe into the drogue. It makes contact with the hose, and fuel flows. Fairly straightforward. The other method, which the Americans used and have actually chose to use in the end as their main one, is this. This goes the opposite way around. This is a boom receptacle method. So you have a receptacle on the receiver airplane, you fly close to the tanker airplane, and then a boom is then extended down into the airplane to make contact. The disadvantage with this is clearly that you can't just stick a hose drum unit on any old airplane and make it into a tanker. And secondly, you need to have a very experienced and able boom operator to be able to fly the boom into the receiver airplane. So why, you may ask, did the Americans use this system? Well, it's twofold. Firstly, actually, it needs an awful lot less skill from the pilot. Instead of actually having to hit a sort of 3-foot diameter ring that's bouncing around, you know, so fly fairly close to another airplane. But secondly, because the boom is actually quite a bit wider than a hose, because a hose is limited by the fact that it's going to wave around too much, you can actually transfer fuel at about 2 or 3 times the rate that you can using the probe and drogue method. So although there's 3 airplanes queuing up one after the other here, they probably, the 3 of them will be refueled in about the same time as on the previous slide, 3 aircraft refueling at the same time. But we Brits went for the probe and drogue system. And this is a picture from the Javelin cockpit. That's the probe. There's the hose drum unit in the Valiant, and there's the drogue there, which he's aiming for. And the Valiants were given Valiant squadrons were given the job of working out how to use air-to-air refueling in the RAF in 1957. And that culminated, or started off with tanker and bomber refueling, and that culminated in 1959 with Michael Beetham, who later became Chief of the Air Staff, flying all the way from Marham in Norfolk all the way down to Cape Town, which established a world record at the time for distance flown. And then, having cracked the problem with how to refuel bombers from Valiants, they then switched on to tactical aircraft, and specifically the Javelin. And the particular point of interest here was how was it possible to deploy a squadron of Javelins out to the Far East if a crisis blew up there. And the way they did this was to run two exercises. One was to send half of the airplane all the way, and then the next year it was to send all the aircraft half the way. So in 1960, trial Operation Dyke sent 4 aircraft all the way out to Singapore, and then the following year, Operation Pounce sent 8 aircraft to Karachi. And that established air-to-air refuelling as the way to send aircraft out to those parts of the world. Javelin squadrons would routinely deploy out to Cyprus using that instead of staging all the way through. And once the Indonesian crisis blew up in 1965, Javelins were actually, a huge number of Javelins, the whole of 64 Squadron in fact, were then transferred out to join the 60 Squadron out in Singapore. But not only just the Javelins, but also when the Lightning came into service, an airplane with a fantastic performance, but also unbelievably short legs on it. And if it was going to intercept enemy aircraft out over the North Sea, it was going to need some sort of support. And all of this was pioneered by the Valiant squadrons, working out how the procedures would work out and all the tactics. But I say, unfortunately, the Valiant was removed from service very quickly in 1965. But that was not the end for good old Brooklands, because this airplane, the Vickers VC-10, entered service the following year, 1966. So we have a virtually continuous run now for Brooklands. 11 aircraft sent off to join 10 Squadron at Brize Norton as transport aircraft, a role they fulfilled right up to the end of the Cold War. But from the 1970s onwards, the RAF realised it needed more tanker aircraft, and their eyes were on these aircraft, thinking, well, could we stick some hose drum units under the wings and turn them into tankers? And at the same time they were thinking that, good old British Airways, my former employer, decided to get rid of their VC-10s, and the RAF snapped them up. These are being parked up at RAF Abingdon. I used to fly from RAF Abingdon at the time with the University Air Squadron. I can remember seeing these things sat on the far side of the airfield there. The Didcot Power Station in the background, and airplanes looking very, very sorry for themselves and dejected and generally left to their own devices there on the far side of the airfield. But they were left there for a couple of years, and then they were all converted, in fact, and these became air-to-air refuelling tankers with 101 Squadron. And you can see one of those aircraft here refueling a couple of Phantoms, again, probably off up in the North Sea somewhere. The 10 Squadron ones did have hose drum units stuck under the wings. They became 2-point tankers. These are 3-point. You can see a 3rd point on the centerline there. And so from the sort of mid to late 1980s, good old Brooklands supplied the RAF with its air-to-air refueling capability. That wasn't the end of the story, really, because the VC-10 continued in service right up until 2013. This photograph's taken in 2012, marking the 50th anniversary of the first flight of the VC-10. So the aircraft went out of service a year later, and so you can see that the VC-10 and indeed Brooklands, the part that they played in the RAF air defence system, was through the Cold War and actually outlasted it by almost a quarter of a century. Ladies and gents, that is all I have to say to you this evening. I might have mentioned that I wrote a book on the subject and never want to parcel up the opportunity for some gratuitous self-promotion. I would point that I do actually have some copies of this fine book here. And if anything that I've said this evening sparks a bit of interest in you, I can recommend it. But also particularly the tactical side of things, because I only did really just brush the corner of that. So if you want to know more, then I can recommend a copy of said book. And we have some copies at the back, and my glamorous assistant here will be very pleased to take £25 off you and give you a copy of the book. But in the meantime, I did say if anybody's still awake, I'd answer any questions. So the floor is open if anybody would like to ask me any questions.
Yes, the photograph that you put up that you claimed was Blue Danube isn't. It's Yellow Sun.
Oh, right, OK. I'm sorry about that. I've got it wrong, haven't I?
So Yellow Sun was after Blue Danube.
OK, right.
Very, very similar in size.
Yes, and probably,
Blue Danube had a pointy with an impact fuse, so I just thought I'd
Well, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, so ignore what I said. The practice drops at Christmas Island, I think, were Blue Danube, but the actual the weapon that was used was actually Yellow Sun, and that was the one we saw the picture of there next to the Valiant. Thank you for putting me right on that.
My late father served in the RAF through the Second World War and the Cold War, and in 1962 came within 3 minutes of firing Thor missiles, and each missile in the firing position was 3 minutes from firing, and each one, I understand, was equivalent to 100 Hiroshimas. A lot of people had mental troubles after that. I'm glad to say my father was much too tough. But has anybody ever calculated how many billions of tons of fuel were used in all these patrols? I was born in 1949, so NATO is the same age as I am.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, in fact, yes, that's a good point, actually. I didn't mention the Thor missiles because I've been talking about airplanes rather than ballistic missiles. But yes, you're right. The RAF did operate a whole bunch of Thor missiles during the 50s and into the early 60s. Yes, I don't know. I mean, the amount of fuel that must have been burnt doing those, particularly those Chrome Dome operations, where flying across both 12 missions a day, going out from the States to Italy, going up to Greenland, going out to Alaska, must have been absolutely phenomenal. I've absolutely no idea. But yes, I think it would be an interesting calculation to do sometime, and quite a frightening amount of fuel must have got burnt up doing just that. And then, of course, you look at whatever the Soviets were doing, etc. as well. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, the thing about the Cold War, or when it ended, was the whole business about a peace dividend. I mean, the amount of money that was spent on defence was quite frightening, and the amount that one might argue was wasted on things like that, yeah, a phenomenal amount of money.
So I think most of us are fairly familiar with the story of the Vulcan. Do you want to just expand a little bit on the
On Victor? Briefly, the Victor, we saw a V-bomber, so initially was in service using free-fall bombs, was using, as we say, the Yellow Sun, and then Blue Steel. But about that same time, only a couple of squadrons became Blue Steel squadrons, and the others were converted into the tanker role with the loss of the Valiant. And we ended up with, and there was also a strategic reconnaissance squadron as well, which right through to about the late 1970s. Eventually, 3 squadrons initially, eventually down to 2 squadrons, and those remained in service as tanker aircraft right up to through the Gulf War and beyond into the early 1990s. I can't remember exactly when they went out of service. I think it was 93, so it would be 94, 95 when they went out of service. But I say, an incredibly good tanker, actually. To refuel from it, it was probably the simplest that certainly I had the British refueling behind, and a very capable machine. And still I think, probably of all the V-bombers, certainly the best looking. And I think probably also much better performance than the Vulcan that had. But I think the Vulcan was that bit stronger and therefore more suited to low-level flying, which is why it kind of got the job and remained in role.
I was interested in your comments on the Russian Air Force to begin with, and of course you mentioned that one of their aircraft looked like one of the American aircraft. The B-29, I think we tend to sort of think they copy our stuff, like Konkordsky and so on. But what's your view, if you have one, on their current aircraft capability, given the history of what they produced up to now? I'm quite interested. We might be fighting it one day, quite soon.
Well, you never know. I think the thing that taught me about Soviet aircraft was a MiG-29 Fulcrum, which was a tactical fighter air superiority aircraft. And I remember seeing one just after the Cold War. I was at RAF Chivner at the time down in Devon, and it flew in for the air show. And the two things were, firstly, it rained so much that they had to put it in a hangar. It got so wet, they had to open all the panels, and we had to get all the electric heaters from all the rooms and buildings on the base and put there to heat this thing up to dry it out. But the fact was that it was similar in performance to an F-16, which did its stuff through really clever electronics, but the Russian one didn't have any of that, and it did really clever stuff through really clever aerodynamics and all the rest of it. So although we tend to write them off, I think their aircraft are very capable. In fact, I'll step back to the MiG-15. If we look at the Korean War, people talk about the Sabre and MiG-15 and how the Sabre shot down lots of MiG-15s. And actually, that's not quite right. And in fact, if you look at the compare the combat performance, the MiG-15 was actually the better airplane of the two. There are reasons why there were losses, but so the Soviet aircraft have actually been pretty good, very robust designs, and I think we would be foolish to underestimate them. My question really is not so much the quality of the aircraft, but actually the quality of the training, and that's why I showed you the picture of Talicha Peak Airfield, and why I mentioned that they're not getting much flying and not intercepting or carrying out realistic interceptions. So yeah, it's not so much the quality of the airplanes, but perhaps more the quality of the air crew.
Good evening. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
The French and the Americans both continue to use tactical nuclear weapons, and the British don't. I was just wondering on your views on that, if it's a good or bad idea for the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm in the modern day.
I think we tend to look at. We always looked at nuclear weapons as being something that would be you'd slowly increase the amount that is called flexible response back in the day. And you'd use them incrementally. So the plan would be that with tactical weapons that you would perhaps drop one just to show you're going to do it. And then if the enemy didn't withdraw, then you might drop two just to show you're still going to do it. And then you might drop lots. And so that's the way we saw things. The Soviets particularly don't see things that way. It's a weapon they use or you don't use. So the idea of graduated response that we have, and it's a kind of Western thing. It's like, actually, if you look at the Vietnam War, how the Americans only attacked certain things to demonstrate they could do it, thinking that the other side would turn around and say, oh, we'll give up then. But actually, that doesn't work. You actually have to go full at it or not. And so the question is, what use is a tactical nuclear weapon? What does it do? If you've got a boatload of Trident missiles, do you really need something else? And the other thing is how practical. I mean, it was our main role, and we believed we could do it. When I look back on it, I'm thinking, dropping a nuclear bomb from low level, I think it had something like a 30-odd second delay, which means going at 9 miles a minute, you're going to be 5 miles away from it, and it goes bang. How big is the blast? How big is the electromagnetic pulse? What is that going to do to the airplane? Whether it would have even been survivable or not, I have no idea. So I don't know. They were great things to have as a threat, but whether they were actually practical or not, I have no idea. And I guess people decided that it probably wasn't a practical thing to do. I mean, do you really need to drop a nuclear bomb on a command bunker if you can hit it very accurately now with a GPS-guided cruise missile? So I think they're probably irrelevant, really. But that's just my view.
It just falls on me to say thank you very much to Michael for what I think has been a fantastic talk and quite illuminating on all the things that certainly I've learned an awful lot tonight. And I think it's been good for all of us. So can I have a big round of applause for Michael?
Thank you.